History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg Campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more. Joel Horst Nofziger is the executive director at the Mennonite Heritage Center. Joel, when did Mennonites first come to Pennsylvania?
So Mennonites first came to Pennsylvania in 1683 with the formation of the Germantown settlement. They came mostly from the Palatinate on the Rhine River, so a few also from the Netherlands settling into Germantown.
And how large was this group?
I think the first settlement was about a dozen families. So we're working with a fairly small group, though as time moves on, and by the 1700s, we see several waves of immigrations. Again, from the Palatinate, some with a few more Swiss German descendants coming in.
Well, let's go back to their places of origin in Europe. Were they farmers? Were they tradespeople? What was their professions?
So we have a really mixed bag of that original cohort that came and settled in Germantown. These were primarily linen weavers, and they very quickly grew flax and started weaving. Those who came with the later white migrations tended much more towards agrarian occupations, farmers, herdsmen, a number of people who ran vineyards.
And let's also go back to Europe as far as the origins of the Mennonite faith itself. Where did it begin?
So Mennonites come out of the broader Anabaptist movement, which is the radical wing of the Protestant Reformation. Normally, we look back to January 21st, 1525 in Switzerland as the starting point for the Anabaptist movement. This year, we're in fact celebrating 500 years of that anniversary. But really, in that Reformation context, where ideas are swirling, society's changing, scripture is being translated into vernacular languages at the same time, you see a lot of small radical groups starting to deal with the same ideas at the same time, sometimes with conversation with others, sometimes not. And those specific ideas are sort of the origins of the Free Church, this idea that church membership is a voluntary commitment symbolized by adult baptism. And so we see that idea popping up in Switzerland, in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands. We see it popping up a little bit in South Germany. And out of sort of the merger of those streams, we see Anabaptist Mennonites developing as a more distinctive group.
Where does the name come from? There was an individual named Menno Simons. Who was he?
So Menno Simons is an early Anabaptist leader working out of the Netherlands. Now, I mentioned the Free Church and adult baptism. Anabaptists also had two other distinctive views that will help understand why Menno is important. First, they practiced Christian nonviolence. And secondly, they refused to swear oaths. These are both specific practices coming out of a broader understanding that being a Christian meant following him in everyday life. Because of that, we see heavy persecution of Anabaptists, partly because when you're in a society that's full of unrest, not fighting, not swearing loyalty to your city is not particularly popular, and adult baptism takes away from the baptismal rolls, which also doubled as tax records. So we see heavy persecution for the Anabaptists. Menno is important not because he's the originator of the Anabaptist movement, but because he through guile and luck, manages to survive much longer than other early Anabaptist leaders. And he works to gather scattered congregations as they're being persecuted and help provide guidance to them. He also, because he lives longer, he also manages to produce a lot more written work for his followers to carry on.
How did the Mennonites in southern Germany and the Netherlands, how did they know to come to Pennsylvania?
So there was a concentrated effort on the behalf of William Penn to recruit Mennonites to come to Pennsylvania. Part of the hook is his promise of religious freedom. William Penn, being a Quaker, also suffered religious persecution firsthand in England. The second part of it is that by this point, Mennonites in the Palatinate had developed a reputation as being especially good farmers. And so William Penn sort of did this double-handed, come work here, you have really good farmland, really good economic opportunities, and you won't have to worry about persecution because we're setting up a colony based around ideals of religious freedom. And so there's lots of pamphlets going back and forth, lots of visits going on trying to encourage Mennonites in the Palatinate to move to Pennsylvania.
In the colonial period, as more and more Mennonites came over, what was the pattern of settlement?
So there's sort of two main paths. You come in the port of Philadelphia, you move to Germantown, which at that point would have been a separate village, not part of Philadelphia proper. It's about 2 miles out from where Philadelphia would have been. And from there you have two choices. The earliest settlement, which is where the area the Heritage Center covers, is going north from Germantown up the Skippack Creek to Skippack, then later on to Salford, Franconia, moving north as far as Lehigh County. The second path is skipping over Chester and moving out to Lancaster. And so we have Lancaster and what was called the Franconia settlement as two early options for Mennonite immigration.
Now, as Mennonites continued to move into Pennsylvania, how did they organize their communities?
So it's a little bit scattered. Mennonites, like many immigrant communities, found the affairs of surviving much more important than keeping records. But in Germantown, we know by 1690 they're organizing a congregation. But though it's another 20 or 30 years until we have the first communion and baptism services in Germantown. In 1725, we see the first sort of Mennonite organizational gathering occur when representatives from both Lancaster and Franconia gather together to adopt the Dordrecht Confession of Faith as a normative document. That's a Dutch Mennonite confession of faith, and they adopt it in a great conference, and that's the first formal organization we have.
How important was the preservation of their native languages after they immigrated?
When we think about Mennonites, we need to understand that Mennonites are working in a Pennsylvania-German Ocean. They're coming over here. They're living with other Pennsylvania Dutch people. They're living with Lutherans and Reformed who are also Low German or Pennsylvania Dutch speaking. And so they get together and they speak that, and they don't have a strong need to learn English. Some of them do. It's not until later that language issues become a key element. We know that certain leaders within the Pennsylvania Assembly and the colony of Pennsylvania are very worried that we have such a large number of German speakers coming into the colony, worrying that will shape the colony in a way that's not beneficial. But it's not a religiously motivated preservation of the language.
Now, as the colonial period moves into the Revolutionary War period, what types of challenges are Mennonites facing as the Revolutionary crisis is coming along?
Well, there's a couple of things to note. The first is, again, with Mennonites being a Christian pacifist group. War and rumors of war were deeply unsettling to Mennonite leaders in Pennsylvania. In fact, in response to the French and Indian War, Mennonite leaders in Franconia worked to translate and publish a book called The Martyr's Mirror. This was a Dutch Mennonite martyrology that aimed to gather stories of nonviolent Christians who were persecuted for their faith. And Franconia Mennonite leaders thought that this would be a very good educational tool to help strengthen the faith and witness of Mennonites in leading up to the Revolutionary period. This was produced actually by the effort of Cloister out in Lancaster. It was the largest book produced in colonial America at the time. Another thing to point out, once we move more closer to the Revolution, we're actually at 250 years from a petition written by Benjamin Hershey to the Colonial Assembly asking for clarity on whether or not the peace churches like Mennonites would be asked to serve in the militia. And Benjamin Hershey wrote that we, that is Mennonites, have dedicated ourselves to serving all men in everything that can be helpful to the preservation of men's lives, but we find no freedom in giving or doing or assisting in anything by which men's lives are destroyed or hurt. This is received a little bit better in Pennsylvania than it would in other places because Quakers who founded Pennsylvania were also a peace church. Once we move into the Revolution, the situation gets even more complex.
So at that time, especially when British troops are in Pennsylvania and occupying Philadelphia, the tensions between loyalists and patriots so oftentimes don't leave a lot of room for people who are not taking sides.
That's correct. It's complicated, but there's maybe 2 points to pull out here. One is when we see the Test Act being initiated, there's an interesting event that occurs at Salcombe Mennonite Church in Northampton County, where 12 members of the congregation are arrested because of their refusal to swear the test oath. And then in fact, all of their possessions are auctioned and they're sentenced to be exiled from the state of Pennsylvania. Now, fairly quickly after that, there is a reprieve granted from the Pennsylvania Assembly where they're not exiled, but they still suffered the confiscation of their property because they were not willing to take a strict revolutionary stance. But we also see one of the earliest fractures within the Mennonite Church happen around a minister named Christian Funk, and who eventually forms his own church, the Funkite Mennonites. And that controversy for Christian Funk was, how do you know if your government is legitimate, which is an especially important question in a revolutionary context. Christian Funk simplified the matter by saying, if you're willing to deal with a government's currency, i.e. the revolutionary dollars, then you're recognizing them as legitimate.
Now, let's talk about some of the key early figures. Who was William Rittenhouse?
So William Rittenhouse is the first minister in America. He was ordained in about 1690 in Germantown, though there was some confusion on his part, or some uncertainties about whether he was fit to be a minister without having ordination by another bishop. There wasn't a Mennonite bishop in America at the time. And so this is why there was that long delay between the formation of the conference and when they have the first baptism and communion services. William Rittenhouse actually dies shortly before those are held. He's also an incredibly important person in colonial Pennsylvania because he starts the first paper mills, which are just there outside of Germantown. He's also the great-grandfather of the famous polymath David Rittenhouse of astronomy fame.
Now, another figure from the colonial period, Christopher Dock. Who was he?
Christopher Dock is perhaps the most important Pennsylvania German colonial schoolmaster. He's a pietist-inclined Mennonite, works in Germantown, Skippack, Salford. He is a Proctor artist in addition, which he used as rewards to his students. Christopher Dock is notable because he produced the first written pedagogy in America, and his key innovation was that rather than punishing students when they do something wrong, you should reward them when they do something well. He says you should give them a bird or a flower. And that's not a literal bird or a flower, but a illustrated drawing of one, sort of a colonial era sticker for a good job.
Let's talk more about Proctor. What is it, and what role does it play within the Mennonite community?
So Proctor is a Pennsylvania, in the American form, is a Pennsylvania German illuminated manuscript. Literally, Proctor means broken writing. It's the same root word as fractured. It's a distinctive broken style of calligraphy, often ornamented with flowers, birds, angels, other sorts of illustrations. Some of them are decorative elements. You know, you have a label in your book to note that your hymn book is yours. You have a nameplate and it's decorated in a Proctor style. Among the church Pennsylvania Germans, Lutheran Reformed, you have Proctor baptismal records. We see less of these in a Mennonite context because of adult baptism. What we see a lot in Mennonite contexts are what's called Vorschriften. These are writing aids where the school teacher will write out a edifying message as well as giving samples of here's how you form your various letters, with the idea that the student can practice his handwriting or her handwriting by copying the letters in the Vorschriften and also gain moral character as they copy the letter in their practice.
Now, you mentioned that Christopher Dock wrote a book on pedagogy. Did the Mennonites have a distinctive approach to education in the colonial period?
It's hard to say, perhaps. Christopher Dock certainly has a distinctive pedagogy where he is much gentler with his students, much less inclined to use corporal punishment. That's not necessarily carried out among all Mennonite school teachers. There's some nuance in there. And Proctor as a school reward is not a distinctive pedagogy to Mennonites. We see that among all the Pennsylvania German school teachers. Mennonites have perhaps preserved it more than some others, but it's not necessarily distinctive.
One of the other figures from the colonial period was Dirk Kaiser. Who was he?
So Dirk Kaiser was a early Mennonite settler in Germantown. Before Germantown Mennonite Church formally organized itself as a congregation, he would often lead a small worshiping group by reading sermons from a book in his private residence. But what I love about Dirk Kaiser is a folk story we receive from him, because Dirk Kaiser was a silk merchant and he liked to wear his silk coats. Now, Mennonites tend to be a people who value simplicity and plainness and not showy displays of wealth. And when some of the other Mennonite leaders in Skippack heard that there was this Mennonite down in Germantown who was wearing silk, they thought, this really won't do. We need to go talk to him and make sure he corrects his ways. And so they get on their horses and they ride down from Skippack to Germantown, and they find Dirk Kaiser in his silk coat working in his garden. And when he sees his visitors arriving, he puts down his spade, he wipes his hands on his silk coat and goes to greet them. And when they realize that this man is willing to dirty his silk cloak, these other ministers realize, we really did not understand. We thought he was wearing his silk coat to be proud, but we see he's not. And so they turn tail and head back home in shame.
Now, you're the executive director of the Mennonite Heritage Center. Where is the center located, and how does it tell the story of Mennonites?
So the Mennonite Heritage Center is located in Harleysville, Pennsylvania, right along Route 113. Right now, we have 3 exhibits on display. Because it's the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism, we have a coat of many colors commemorating 500 years of Anabaptist faith and practice, which looks at how Mennonites have lived out their faith locally and internationally over the last 500 years. But Mennonites are also working in a local context. So we also have Peace and Plenty, Life in the Central Perkiomen Valley, which looks at the general facts of life, business, and farming here in our local community. And finally, in our art gallery, we have Proctor, the Art of Reading, Writing, and Religion, showing off many of our fine pieces of Proctor in our collection.
We've been speaking with Joel Horst Nofziger. He's the executive director at the Mennonite Heritage Center. Joel, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.